All right, well, welcome. I'm Professor Habib, the Director of the Honors Program, and this is a very special guest of the Honors Program, Professor Gregory Sadler, and I have the honor of introducing him to you today. Sorry, 3 classes in a row. My mind a little mush. In any event, I have to tell you, I am so excited. One of my favorite parts of this job is when I get to geek out and sit in the audience and just be an intellectual sponge. I came across Dr. Sadler, believe it or not, through the internet. Now, I know that sounds shady. Let me explain what I mean. I was on YouTube and I was looking for, like most average Americans, something like Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, or Kierkegaard, and I came across his YouTube channel. And I think what you're going to see is what I saw, and the reason why he's here today, an extraordinary teacher. He was walking through really heavy arguments and concepts with just such ease. I was just stunned. And there were essentially recordings of his courses at Marist in New York. And then I kind of subscribed, to his channel. And I started following him, and now there's a restraining order on him. And then I met him and learned he was in the military, so I backed off. But I was really amazed by the depth and the breadth of his teaching, and I thought that true to the pattern of our guest speakers, he would be a great person to come and stop by and see the honors program. And he's truly remarkable, and I had a wonderful opportunity to have quite a long lunch, long because I was eating a lot, and got to hear more about what he's up to and what he's doing, and I really recommend, highly recommend, in fact, you find him on YouTube. We'll be putting something up after this talk so you can find him online and follow his work. But as far as his bio goes, Dr. Sadler is the author of a great book entitled Reason Fulfilled by Revelation, and several dozen articles, book chapters, and encyclopedia entries on figures and movements in the history of philosophy. And there, again, get a sense of just how wide the breadth of philosophy is. He teaches philosophy and religious studies courses for Marist College. He's the president and co-founder of Reason.io, an educational consulting company, and produces online lectures on philosophy in his popular YouTube channel. He is currently developing the Existentialism course for a new online and about to receive accreditation educational institute at Apollonian, which he just told me over lunch is a word that doesn't exist. So I'm not sure that's how you want to start an online education. But the class is planned to go live in early April, and without further ado, Dr. Sadler is going to walk us through Friedrich Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. So please help us welcome Dr. Sadler.
I'm very pleased to be here, and it's tough to follow up such a generous introduction like that and jump into an academic lecture. There's the worry it could be a little dry, but hopefully it won't be for you. I'd like to thank Khalil for inviting me. This has been quite a while in process, and I'd like also to thank the honors program here. It sounds like there's a lot of great things going on with it, and I think that many students in many places would be very fortunate to have something like this, something where there's a comprehensive education and a devotion to looking at great literature and trying to dig into it. I was just talking with a graduate student who's helping to do some of the filming here before class, and I was saying, a lot of the things that you're coming across in these great books, they won't make as much sense to you at 21 as they will when you're 31 and have held a full-time position for some time and have a mortgage and children. But if you've got a good foundation in these great works of literature, and they're classics because every generation has found them useful over time, it'll come back to you when you need it. So those are just a few sort of reflections on why it's so great to have a great books program. This is a pretty dense and rich work. How many of you have read The Birth of Tragedy, or at least dug around in it a bit? Okay, so very few. So I don't want to scare you off from it. It is dense. It does presuppose a bit of exposure to some of the people that Nietzsche is writing about, but you may have read them in other classes, Sophocles and Aeschylus, and of course this guy Socrates, who's going to be a main character in this. But it's a very rewarding work to look at as well. So I first encountered it when I was about your age, as a college student in a contemporary philosophy class, where that was the one book of Nietzsche that we read that semester. And I keep coming back to it because there's a lot of, for me, still unanswered questions and insights yet to be sort of refined within it. There's a few things I want to say at the start, too, about it. This is Nietzsche's first major work. And like a lot of first books, he saw it as an immature effort. He actually wrote an attempt at self-criticism a little bit later on. And I want to just read you a few things from that. He said that he lacked the courage to permit himself in every way an individual language of his own for such individual views and hazards. He tried to ground it on some other philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Schopenhauer, rather than being bold enough to go off on his own. And he talks about having had some hasty hopes and hasty application of the present. And that really has to do with his aspirations for the German people and German culture, which later on he'd repudiate. That played an important role in this work early on. Nevertheless, he recognizes a few things. He says that the task which this audacious book dared to tackle for the first time was to look at science in the perspective of the artist and at art in that of life. And by science, he means the disciplines, anything that's rigorous, any attempt to gain knowledge. He also thought that there were some parallels between the time of the Greeks and the modernity that he was experiencing as a European. Just to put it in context, we're talking about somebody who died at the turn of the century in 1900. Insane at the time. So you probably shouldn't hold that against him. The last years of his life were not particularly good ones. But he's writing at a time when Europe is very self-confident. And at the same time, there's a lot of, in his view, sort of cultural rot taking place. And the question that we want to think about with this work is it just a historical work? Or do some of his reflections help us understand our own times and culture as well? And I hope that through this lecture you'll see that they do. There's an important term, there's the last sort of proviso that I have to say. There's an important term that I've used in the title, nihilism, which you may have come across before. How many of you have heard this term nihilism or nihilistic? Nietzsche didn't come up with it. It had been around for a while. If you ever read Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, you'll see a character in there who calls himself a nihilist. Nietzsche saw nihilism as the fundamental problem of modernity. You may have heard of him talking about the death of God, meaning the devaluation of the highest values, a sense that life doesn't really have any meaning, an evacuation of the meaning that used to be able to be found in life. Bless you. That's what he's targeting in a lot of his later works. And he doesn't use the term in this work, but you can see what he's doing here as being a diagnosis of the nihilism that's taking place, as he sees it, from Socrates on in ancient Greece, and then in European culture. But he also has some high hopes. At that time, he's tying these high hopes to the German people and the German nation and German music and German philosophy. After he gets rid of that sort of connection, he starts talking about things in a more individualistic way in his later works. So what I want to do in this lecture is a few main things. I want to outline the main developments and the themes, some of the aspirations of this book, The Birth of Tragedy. Foremost among these is a distinction that I'm going to introduce you to If you only take one thing away from this, I suppose this would be the thing to take away: the opposition between the Dionysian and the Apollonian. And you'll see how this plays out in a lot of ways in our lives. Then I want to explore some of the distinctions that Nietzsche makes between these and chart how they came together in this genre that we call tragedy, Greek tragedy. Specifically the Greek tragedy of Aeschylus and Sophocles. And then I want to backtrack a bit and point out what doesn't actually fit neatly into this scheme. This is a book that, when it does get read, I would say, at least in my experience, half the people who read it badly and turn this distinction between Apollonian and Dionysian into the entire theme of the book, and they start seeing everything in the world through that lens. And there's a lot more going on in this book than just that. So we want to backtrack and look at that. Then we want to explore the third main path, the third main tendency, which Nietzsche calls the Socratic and Alexandrian, after the sort of Library of Alexandria type of culture, and what's going on with that and what it does to tragedy and why we should care. That's another thing I didn't put on here, but certainly we should answer that question. And we want to look at this culture, this Socratic Alexandrian culture, a bit more broadly. We want to see whether the things that he's saying about it actually apply to our own culture. We don't want to look at this as just merely a history of ancient Greece by some German around the turn of the last century. We want to see if this actually tells us anything about our own condition. And then, if we have time, we'll look at Nietzsche's discussion of what he's not naming, but identifying in terms of nihilism, and then the opportunities for some sort of renewal, something beyond that he's charting out. It's always good when you do a lecture, if you have a time frame, to say, well, we'll get to the really, really important stuff if we have the time, because then, you're sort of off the hook, all right? But we will get to it in this case. So this key distinction between the Dionysian and Apollonian. You have a handout. Actually, you have several handouts. I suppose I should say something about those. One of them is just for you to take notes on. It's the breakdown of what we're going through. On the flip side of that, you have this thing about the Apollonian and Dionysian. You see these little pictures of the statues there, which is kind of apropos for the Apollonian, since he is the father of the plastic arts. And then there's another one that has to do with the development of genres, because this book is really about the development and degeneration of genres, artistic genres. So we've got this key distinction, the Dionysian and the Apollonian. Before we go into charting out what this is, we should look at some of the ways Nietzsche characterizes these. These are not metaphysical principles. These are not things that you can divide all of the universe up into, like some people would do with different polarities, like yin and yang, in some Asian philosophies. It's not meant to be that sort of thing. It is meant to point out two different artistic, what he calls drives or tendencies, Triebe in German. He says there's a dichotomy, there's an opposition, there's an antagonism, there's a duality, Doppelheit, between them. But he never comes out and says this is a dualism. This is supposed to cover all of what exists. There's a tendency to read this as dualism. So if you just Google Apollo and Dionysus or Apollonian and Dionysian, you'll see a lot of essays come up. As a matter of fact, one of the most interesting ones that I saw said that if you're teaching writing to students, just teach them this distinction and you can fit everything into it. You can classify any sort of experience as a matter of either the Apollonian or Dionysian or some sort of mixture or balance between the two. Like, for instance, during the week, what is your week like? It's very regimented, very scheduled. You have to show up at certain places at certain times. That's Apollonian. Order, structure. On the weekend, what happens? More order and structure? What do we do on the weekend? What's that? Somebody said party? I mean, that's what we would do in our time. I don't know, what do you college students do on the weekend? Just hit the book some more? You enjoy yourself. You let go. You have some relaxation, and also along with that goes some excess. And so this professor who wrote an article about this said, yeah, you can shove everything into these categories, and it will make perfect sense for your students. As a matter of fact, I think one of the things said this is the only theme you actually need to teach. It reminds me of that saying of always beware the man with one book. If somebody only has one set of concepts to work with, you got to watch out for them. And you have to do the same thing with Apollonian and Dionysian. Let's look at what he's actually saying. So Apollo and Dionysus, they're Greek gods. And they're not the only Greek gods, but why did Nietzsche pick on these? Because they're emblematic of something. Those of you who remember your classical literature, what is Dionysus the god of? What is he known for? In Latin, he would be Bacchus. Yeah, that's the foremost thing. Now, what tends to go along with drinking? Yeah.
Sexual interaction.
Yeah, sometimes they would worship him with orgies. But usually there were a lot of things leading up to that, like, crazy dancing, like festivals, like just, letting everything go. He's sort of the god of excess, the god of having a great time, and perhaps going beyond just having a great time to, how would you put it, a weekend that lasts forever. Apollo, what do you associate him with if you think about ancient Greek gods and goddesses? Yeah. Yeah, he's made into a sun god. He sort of supplants Helios as that. What else? Anything else he's known for? Yeah.
Musical harmony.
Yeah. He's depicted with the lyre. Dionysus is depicted with the pipes. Actually, not him, but his satyrs who hang around with him. And Apollo, it's much more restrained. He's the guy who'd make you sit down and learn the scales over and over again. He's the patron of the plastic arts. He's supposed to actually be the leader of the muses, the goddesses who are to inspire the various arts. And he's also the god of sort of order and wisdom. And you see this in some counsels that are given at his oracle in Delphi. Know thyself and nothing to excess. Order and limit. So Nietzsche starts out by talking about a physiological experience that we can associate with these two. And he talks about Dionysus being associated with intoxication. Makes sense, wine, right? And Apollo being associated with the dream. And the reason why he talks about it this way, he's saying, look, even before we get into artistic products, we're talking about things that we experience, things that generation after generation experiences. Intoxication. What happens when we become intoxicated besides falling down and making stupid decisions and things like that? He's trying to get to the essence of what it's like. And he says, over and over again, people are getting intoxicated with music or dance, with drinking, with various drugs. Even the coming of spring, for people who are attuned to that, would produce a kind of intoxication. And what happens with intoxication? You forget yourself. He doesn't use the word ecstasy there, but that would be, ecstasis, being outside of yourself. And not being outside of yourself like you're just lost somewhere. For Nietzsche throughout this work, it's an experience of the primal unity of all things. You are reattached to this sort of upsurge of being that's always productive, spilling over into life itself, and which doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. It's contradictory. Parts of it jar against each other, but it's vital. It's what's really there under the appearances for Nietzsche. By contrast, the Apollonian, the dream. What's happening when you dream? You have images. And now, it depends on what kind of dreams you have. You might have the dream where you get chased by a demon or something like that. That's pretty scary. He's not thinking about that so much. He's thinking about the kinds of dreams where you're just a spectator. and you're seeing things. And these images seem very meaningful to you, but it's very difficult to communicate that meaning. Their meaning resides within themselves. Now, when we move away from just these physical or somatic or bodily manifestations, and we start looking at artistic responses, Nietzsche thinks that these are both responses to life itself, which is felt as a problem. Sometimes he thinks we need to lose ourselves in Dionysiac reveling. And there are certain artistic genres or means that do that, music in particular. It's very difficult to talk cogently about music. Why is that? It's also very difficult to do this with things in matters of taste, like wine tasting. Because you're experiencing something that you feel, something that is vital, something that impinges upon you. And the Greeks, Nietzsche thinks, they had that going on, but their Dionysiac or Dionysian was a little bit different than other people. So you contrast them against the barbarians. And, barbarians for the Greeks meant everybody who wasn't Greek. And what was the problem with a lot of the barbarians? Well, they would engage in these Dionysiac rituals, and it really wouldn't go anywhere. They would just have a great time and let off some steam and maybe kill a few people, or have an orgy, or who knows what else. I mean, a lot of the stuff the Greeks say about other people we got to take with somewhat of a grain of salt from time to time, the way we do with any depiction of another ethnicity. But there wasn't any progress. There wasn't anything coming out of it, was his view. The Greeks were the Apollonian culture par excellence for Nietzsche. And they were different than other cultures that had this emphasis on order, structure. He contrasts them in the early part of the book to the Egyptians, for whom everything was kind of frozen. Again, perhaps an overstatement on the part of the Greeks. And he contrasts them against the Romans much later on as being, the individuating people par excellence, the political people par excellence. The Greeks found a sort of happy medium. And the Apollonian for the Greeks was an achievement, an imposition of order, of structure, and also a creation. The Olympian gods, what Nietzsche calls the entire order of joy and beauty, comes about by imposing something, some structure, some limits on the titanic that precedes it, on the barbaric, on the monstrous, carving out a space. Think to yourself about a Greek temple with the columns, all of them more or less identical, robust, in place, holding back, at least one place, holding back all the chaos that inhabits the rest of the world. That's the Greek Apollonian. And Nietzsche says that when the Dionysiac conquers the Apollonian, it just levels everything. But if the Apollonian can resist it, then, like a sea sort of being, checked, you can start to harness that energy that the Dionysian brings. That's what actually took place, according to Nietzsche, in the development of Greek tragedy. Also in some other developments as well. So now let's look at these genres. And this is where the handout might be useful for you. So the Apollonian genre par excellence, Nietzsche's thinking in terms of poetry, would be Homer and the epic poetry. So, if you haven't read the Odyssey or the Iliad, you should give it a read after Nietzsche and see if it conforms to this. You're hearing a story about gods and heroes, and other people too, a few ordinary Joes. Generally they end up with spears stuck through them, or, they're the ones eaten by the monsters while Odysseus escapes. But you have people being depicted. And what's going on when you're hearing, because that's the way it was originally done, hearing the Homeric epic? you're contemplating images. Images that have been coalesced into words. And you're supposed to enjoy it. You're not supposed to actually see yourself there in the story. You're supposed to have a sort of detachment. There's an individuation that's taking place with the Apollonian. That's part of what makes reading the Iliad so much fun. There's all these characters, and what are they doing? And they get into all these interesting scrapes, and even some of the gods are not invulnerable. You know, Diomedes gets to stab Aphrodite, right? That's the Apollonian genre par excellence. By contrast to that, there's lyric poetry. And this is probably a lot closer to what we would talk about as lyrics in terms of music today. Lyric poetry is centered on the person, on the self. He uses Archilochus as a prime example. Guy who had a pretty bad life in many respects and is complaining about it. And Nietzsche thinks that lyric poetry is not really just subjective poetry. That's a mistake to look at it as subjective versus objective. He says that the artist actually identifies himself with the primal unity, its pain and contradiction. The artist becomes the moving center of the world in verse, in writing these things. And the lyricist is able to identify their self, not their empirical self, but the deeper self underneath, with a truly existent and eternal self at the basis of things. So the lyricist is really bringing music and its power into poetry through images, through symbols, which are actually projections of the self. Nietzsche talks a little bit about folk song, and one of the things that he says is that in folk song, this might be a little debatable, but it's an interesting idea to try on. The music actually drives the words. As a matter of fact, he criticizes opera later on for doing the opposite, where the words, you've come up with a bunch of great words, and now you just got to find some music, and any music will do to make it fit. He'd probably criticize show tunes for the same thing in our time. He wouldn't be a big fan of Broadway. In folk music, you have the tune, the melody, which is felt to be vital, expressive of something. And now it's got to find words. And the words might be about, pursuing this person for some sort of, romantic tryst. It might be about how we killed these guys who are trying to kill us. It might be about stealing something. It could be about, the tree and the acorn. Who knows? The words will find their way for the melody. And in them you have a fusion of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. This is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen in tragedy. In folk music, it's kind of simplistic, what's going on. In tragedy now, it's going to get very complicated. So let's look at tragedy. Nietzsche has in mind what we could call old tragedy, by opposition to the new tragedy of people like Agathon, who we don't have much of. But Nietzsche would also lump Euripides in there as well. And old tragedy begins with the chorus. How many of you have read Greek tragedies? A good proportion of you. There's a chorus in all these old Greek tragedies, and in some of the modern things that are trying to emulate them. And one of the questions that people were trying to figure out much later on is, why do you have this chorus in there? What role are they actually playing? Are they like the moral voice? Are they just sort of a leftover thing from festivals? Because these plays were originally done at festivals, and the chorus was originally what the things began with. And then they started acting. They started adding actors to the stage to represent things. And after a while, then you get tragedy actually, as we know it, developing. So is the chorus merely something archaic, something that you don't actually need? Nietzsche says no. The chorus is actually the representation of the Dionysiac. When you belong to a chorus, you are losing yourself. You're forgetting who you are, your civic role, your personal role. You become this group of people. You're a sort of unity. And you might be, chewing out Antigone or chewing out Creon, or you might be, doing this or that role. It kind of depends on what the play is. But the chorus is the Dionysiac element. Now, there has to be some development, and part of the development takes place through the Dionysian, running into the Apollonian. Nietzsche says that tragedy is a Dionysiac chorus which ever anew discharges itself in an Apollonian world of images. He says it's the womb which gives birth to dialogue. So just like with folk songs, where music was driving the words, originally it's this festival, the Dionysiac chorus, and then you start to have characters emerging from it, individuating themselves from it. We look at individuals as if individuals are prior to everything else. That's an unusual way to look at things. Hegel suggested, and this is a different work, that for the ancient people, the real problem was not how to tie the individual back into society. That's the modern problem. It was instead, how does the individual actually emerge from the consciousness, the broader shared consciousness of the society? How do you become an individual? How do you stand out? That's what's happening through the chorus and through dialogue, through explanation of what's happening, through staking a claim. I am going to stand for this, or I'm going to stand for that. The Apollonian contribution, he says, is a new world, clearer, more understandable, more moving than the everyday world, and yet more shadowy. Dionysus speaks to us as an epic hero. So the Dionysian is supplying the energy, the primal experience. The Apollonian, you could think of it as containers that things are going into. And there's a real interplay between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. He says the Apollonian wants to sort of grant repose, individuation, order, limits. The Dionysian keeps this from becoming rigid, from just coalescing. It supplies it with not only, as I said, the energy, but you might say the very basis of the plot. What is a plot in most tragedies? A clash between different perspectives. A clash between people who are sometimes almost equally right, but whose perspectives cannot all be reconciled together. The Apollonian also generates myth. And Nietzsche sees, this is very interesting, sometimes we look at Greek tragedies as if, well, the Greek myths were all out there already, and they just needed some material, so they kind of, they said, well, I'll throw this story in here, and I'll rework it a bit. Nietzsche doesn't think that's what's going on. He thinks that myth is developing in its greatest way through tragedy. So you might think about, Aeschylus and his treatment of Prometheus, the Prometheus myth. He says, through tragedy, the myth attains its most profound content. And that's what's going on in early Greek tragedy. Now, we want to go back a little bit. We've talked a lot about the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And as I said, there's this tendency to kind of say, well, everything in the world is Apollonian or Dionysian. We've got a set of categories that we can fit everything into. Sort of like, how many of you read René Descartes or encountered Descartes? So you know this notion of dualism. Everything is either mind or spirit, esprit, or matter. And it's kind of hard to figure out exactly how they interact, but that's pretty much it. But that's not actually the whole story in Descartes, because there's a third substance, God, totally different than either one of those. That often gets left out in the Wikipedia account. And it's the same thing with the Apollonian and Dionysian in this work. They're not meant to cover everything. So, we could look at this in a couple different ways. We could talk about the unsustainable Dionysian that can't really remain Dionysian for very long. So Nietzsche talks about these outbreaks of what we might call collective irrationality. Very exciting when they happen, but then they're over and everyone is like, well, what happened? I don't know. Now let's get back to work. Let's clean up the marketplace, take all, wash all the soot and streamers off, figure out where I left my car, that sort of thing. There's not a lot of, nothing's really coming out of that. So it's Dionysian, but not for very long. Then there's the sort of opposite of that, which would be when the Apollonian becomes too rigid. And this is what he thinks is the problem with the Egyptians. He also, like I said, talks about Roman individualism and the secularity that comes with it. And the Apollonian without myth, the mere dream state by itself, without anything to anchor it, just becomes aimless wanderings. And you know, if you want a modern day sort of analog for this, do any of you use Pinterest? So what is Pinterest about? Facebook is about connection and sharing things. And don't say something like, you know, cakes or wedding plans. I mean, what is it really? What is its media? What does it work with, fundamentally? Yeah. Images, right. And when Pinterest first came out, maybe some of you got wrapped up in this, there were people who lost hours and even days just sort of wandering through all these images, because they're all linked to each other. And you can stare at this stuff all day. And it was very high resolution, you know. I suppose something like that might happen on Instagram. I don't know, because I don't use Instagram. But I know that happened with other picture sharing things like Flickr. Some people I know would just, you know, get caught up in that. Nietzsche talks about that. That's not really the Apollonian. That's just puttering around with images all day long. He also talks about the everyday world and existence. The Apollonian and the Dionysian are a break, in a certain way, from the everyday world. So to say that the Apollonian is all about order, structure, you know, and calendars, that's not really accurate. The Apollonian is something set apart, something special. There's another thing, too, that's a little bit contrasted with this, and you have to pay attention to this when you're reading this work. Nietzsche talks about the horror or nausea of existence. And is that what the Dionysian is really about? Not exactly. These are all responses to, ultimately, the meaninglessness of existence as such. There are all ways to try to bring meaning to existence. People want to say a lot of times that Dionysian is what's most real, and the Apollonian is sort of a substructure. No, what's most real is actually neither the Dionysian nor the Apollonian. It's something else that's even harder to name, but which can give us, you know, this disagreeable sensation. So now let's go back and look at tragedy. And Nietzsche asks, well, what happened to tragedy? And I think it's better to ask who happened to tragedy, because that's who he's going to talk about. And the first person he's going to start criticizing, because now he's very critical, is Euripides. When we talk about Greek tragedy, say in humanities classes, we often present it as if you got these three great guys, you know, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, and they're all like in continuity with each other, and just, you know, Aeschylus, he's doesn't quite know exactly what he's doing, and Sophocles himself said that about Aeschylus. And then Sophocles is even better, and then Euripides, now we got the really great stuff. Nietzsche says, no, it's not like that. As a matter of fact, Euripides didn't know what he was doing either. But he thought that he did, and he thought that these other guys didn't. And he's a radical departure from what these other two and the people, they weren't the only tragic playwrights. They're the ones whose plays we have. There's plenty of other guys who, we don't know whether their plays were good or bad, because we don't have them. But something changed with Euripides. Euripides doesn't get the Dionysian, and he wants to dispel it. He wants to take it off the scene. He sees it as archaic. It doesn't belong there. And Nietzsche says, this is a really great phrase, and I'll leave you to dig around in the book to find it. He says, Euripides dispensed with the Dionysian, and in the process, Apollo abandoned him as well. What Euripides wanted is the sort of clarity, the individuation, the dialogue, all the elements that were Apollonian, to be cut off from this primitive, messy, not quite, you know, easy to explain root. He didn't realize it was the root. Maybe some of you, if you've ever done gardening, have made mistakes like that, where you think you're weeding, and really you're pulling up a lot of other good stuff at the same time. And then your parents come out and they want to know why those plants that they bought at great expense are all dead. That's what Euripides did. According to Nietzsche. I mean, there are other interpretations which would say, Nietzsche, you're wrong, and Euripides is the best, including Euripides and Socrates. So he attempts to base tragedy solely on the Apollonian, but it slips away from him. Nietzsche frames this in terms of bringing the spectator on the stage. This is where Euripides is doing something quite revolutionary, something different. He brings the spectator on the stage, the characters on the stage, instead of being these sort of archetypes, become naturalistically depicted. They become much more like the everyday person. They explain themselves. At the same time, there's kind of a dialectic going on here. So you've got the characters being done differently, being much more self-conscious, being given to, providing explanations of what they're doing. The audience is also becoming more sophisticated. It's being trained to look for explanations, to look for everything to be made clear. He says the audience, this is Nietzsche, is being trained, bless you, to expect, to desire differently, to want things explained in rational, non-mythical terms. And here's where it gets really interesting. So we've got Apollo and Dionysus. Which of these is it? It's neither. Nietzsche says that a deity did speak through Euripides, and it was neither Apollo nor Dionysus. Who was it? Aphrodite? No, it's none of the other gods. It's Socrates. Socrates is the deity that's speaking through Euripides. And he talks about what he calls aesthetic Socratism. In order for things to be beautiful, they must be understandable. They have to be rational. We want to represent characters, not eternal types, but naturalistically depicted individuals. And there's a couple things that, if you think about music, if you were to take our current genres of music, if you take stuff out of them, like a drum track, you got to put something else in to provide rhythm, right? So maybe you supply something else along those lines. Something else has to supply those functions. The Apollonian and the Dionysian were both giving tragedy some elements. And once you take those bases away, you've got to have something else to replace those elements. So here's how Nietzsche depicts it. He says, the Apollonian contemplation was replaced by cool paradoxical thoughts. Dialectic is replacing contemplation. The Dionysian ecstasies are replaced by fiery affects, by emotions that are copied realistically. The Apollonian gets pared down to logical schematism, he says, and the Dionysian gets pared down to affects depicted naturalistically. And I think a really prime case for this would be the depiction of Medea by Euripides, if you wanted to pick a test case for Nietzsche. Now, what about this Socrates guy? All of you have encountered him, right? At one time or another in your classes? Probably through reading Plato. How many of you read Xenophon? Because you get a somewhat different Socrates. Should read Xenophon. I know a guy you can read him with, too. So he's the guy to talk to afterwards about Xenophon. What did Socrates do that was so important? It wasn't just living a while. Why was he such an unusual character? We shouldn't lose sight of this when we're reading. We should always be a little bit amazed at the stuff that this guy comes out with when we read a Platonic dialogue. Or else we're losing a bit of,
He limited the scope of philosophy to fundamental human things, as opposed to just a study of the natural world.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, he's got that great line in the Apology. Who do you think you're prosecuting? Anaxagoras? To Miletus. There's that. He's said to have brought philosophy from heaven down to earth and to focus on the human. But he did it in a way that's different than other people who are focusing on the human. How is he different, say, than Solon, who wrote poetry, by the way, and who was one of the wise men of Greece? Solon knew his limits. Socrates, in a certain way, didn't. according to Nietzsche again. Socrates is doing some really old, unconventional, new stuff. He is the most optimistic person out there because he thinks it's possible to actually know things. He's not claiming he actually does know things, but he thinks that you can, and that you can use this corrosive technique of dialectic, of questioning people, to get at what's really real. We can sweep away the illusions of knowledge that all these other people, like the politicians and the poets, are making claims to, and we can really have it once and for all. That is revolutionary. And Nietzsche's right about that. So with Socrates, there's this optimism of the capacity to attain knowledge as a kind of faith. And it's an illusion, according to Nietzsche. It's a third kind of artistry. The Apollonian has its artistry. The Dionysian has its artistry. Socrates is an artist without actually topping to being so. Socrates thinks that anything really valuable must be understandable. It must be teachable. It must be able to be replicated. His mission is to not only know existence all the way down to the deepest abysses of being, it's to correct existence. That's something very different than what's going on prior to him. And so Nietzsche actually sees Socrates as the father of the scientific way of looking at things. He calls him the theoretical man as opposed to the tragic man. And he thinks that we live in an age of Socratism. Some new genres come about. There's the new tragedy. And how many of you have read Aristotle's Poetics? Okay, so a few. That's another good one to read, and that would be a great counterposition to Nietzsche on some of these things. Aristotle does, though, say, in the old tragedies, here's how they did dialogue. They made them sound like statesmen. Nowadays, they really sound like rhetoricians. So if you really want to learn how to write dialogue, study rhetoric, because that's what they're doing these days. What's the difference there? Well, rhetoric there's something going on that's different in rhetoric than the sort of clash in political life. Rhetoric is something that can be taught as an art. It's debatable whether it's really an art or not, or a science, but at least they found schools, and this became very common in ancient times. And then they had all sorts of really boring exercises. Compose a speech about why Achilles should have done this, and all the students would, write down their speech and deliver their speech. Now, start pushing that into plays, and it starts to become kind of formulaic, kind of cut off from anything vital. There was also the new comedy, and think about bad sitcoms, where they're rather predictable and snarky, and you can watch them. With Netflix, you just watch episode after episode after episode of something, and then at the end of the day, you're like, man, that was a waste of time. Why did I didn't get anything out of that. I laughed a bit, but it's sort of like eating junk food all the time. There's nothing sustaining you there. The old comedy with Aristophanes, there's things to think about there. The new comedy is just kind of light fare, funny, but ultimately unsatisfying. There's another genre that comes on the scene that Nietzsche says is directly connected with these, and that's Platonic dialogues. And it's really, his characterization of Platonic dialogues is fascinating. He says that all the older forms of poetry found their refuge in the Platonic dialogue. And if, Plato really is a poet. He is able to take, there's all sorts of paradoxes with Plato. One is, he seems to be very anti-poetry. He's against imitation, mimesis, and yet he's able to imitate everybody. If you read the Symposium and you read it in Greek, you'll see him imitating the styles of all these different genres of writing, and including the tragic playwright who sounds like a rhetorician at the time, a Gorgian rhetorician. The problem with Platonic dialogues is all these forms of poetry are saved, but they're all jumbled together, and none of them are really done all the way through. It's being turned into kind of like a museum. Nietzsche doesn't use that term, but I think that's a good way to think about it. He actually says, this is a funny thing to say, the barge on which the shipwrecked ancient poetry saved herself with all her children, crowded into a narrow space and submitting timidly to the single pilot, who would be Plato or Socrates. So what's happened here? Let's sort of take stock at this point. We had the development of tragedy through this fusion of the Apollonian and Dionysian and its expression in these great playwrights, and then this Socratic response, which is something quite different, comes on the scene. This incredible faith in the knowability of everything, and the capacity to improve the world, to do so through knowledge, through transparency. And everything starts going downhill after that. You know, for a lot of people, the history of philosophy kind of begins with Socrates, right? He's the guy who brought... The pre-Socratics were kind of putzing around, not really, getting a lot done. And then this guy Socrates comes on the scene, and then Plato comes after him, and then Aristotle. For Nietzsche, actually, Socrates is the beginning of the end. And everything gets messed up after that, worse and worse and worse. And then, after the Renaissance, that's just more of the same. Things were actually going not so badly in the Middle Ages, in this book at least. And then they found these ancient texts, and everybody wants to be a Socrates. So he talks about this Socratic or Alexandrian culture. He talks about Greek cheerfulness. And here is where we start to see nihilism raising its head. There's this hunger for knowledge, and he says it reached a never-suspected universality. It spread a common net of thought across the world. It's combating anything Dionysian as being just mysterious, being irrational. So it's cutting itself off from its roots, and it's living a sort of superficial existence away from the depths, and saying this is all there is. This is as good as it gets. Lacking myth. In the Socratic age, people begin to latch onto myths from all sorts of other cultures. They've destroyed their own myths, and this is actually what does happen in Hellenistic culture. They start looking at all these other religions and bringing them in. This is also happening in Rome later on too. Those are all problems. Those are all signs for Nietzsche of a decadent culture. He also notes a sort of class dynamic problem. Alexandrian culture requires a slave class. And before, you could tell the slaves, well, look, if you don't do what we want you to do, you're not going to like it. You're going to like it even less than what you're liking now. But Socratic culture kind of raises the stakes, because it talks about everybody having the capacity to learn, about, it faces a lot of distinctions. And people start to say, well, why exactly should I be subjugated and getting the short end of the stick? And the responses that it can provide are not satisfying for very long. You can talk about the universal brotherhood of humanity all you want, but somebody who's suffering is not going to find that very satisfying, and pretty soon they're going to get angry and want to change things. And you don't want to be the person on the wrong end of history when it comes to these successive changes that are happening. And Nietzsche thinks this is something that goes along with this Socratic culture. We could ask the question in our own time, because we've displaced a lot of this to technology, whether we can solve the problem simply by offshoring it to our technology, or whether that produces new problems. There's kind of an intellectual consumerism. Again, not a word Nietzsche uses because it wasn't in existence at his time, but we could think of it this way. People are just sort of picking and choosing, and with consumerism there's this need to fill in a gap, a feeling that there's something missing. And so people buy, and they spend a lot of time, comparison shopping and looking at the virtues of the products, but they're not happy with what they get. And all that time and energy that's being spent there is not being spent doing anything truly meaningful. That's what Socrates thinks is happening in the Alexandrian age. Bless you. So, Nietzsche, I keep wanting to say Socrates, Nietzsche thinks that this is a problem in the ancient world, and it's what's happened in modern Europe. In The Birth of Tragedy, his remedy for this is, well, you know, everybody else might be in a bad spot, but at least we Germans, we've got German music, which seems to be expressing something like this. We're getting a reconnection with the Dionysian through guys like Wagner, and you know, that can bring about a new Apollonian, a new myth that we can all sort of subscribe to. He thinks German philosophy is helping to support this. Later on, he's going to abandon these ideas. And so the question that we want to work with is it possible to have a more individualistic way of reintroducing the meaning that the Apollonian and the Dionysian used to provide into our own lives? Or are we stuck with this current condition? And where we'll leave off, there's a few passages about this sort of spirit of science and the current condition of humanity that Nietzsche is expressing at his own time. This optimistic attitude of everything can be known, everything can be improved, we can fix everything. It's just knowledge that we need. We got to get rid of myth. We have to get rid of mystery. That's great until you start to run into the limits of science, the limits of knowledge. And so he talks about it in this way. He says, science, spurred by its powerful illusion, speeds irresistibly towards its limits, where its optimism, concealed in the essence of logic, suffers shipwreck. Theoretical man, alarmed and dissatisfied at his own consequences, no longer dares entrust himself to the terrible icy current of existence. He runs timidly up and down the shore. He feels that a culture based on the principles of science, this is Nietzsche, must be destroyed when it begins to grow illogical, to begin to retreat before its own consequences. And Nietzsche says this is a good thing. So long as you're optimistic about this Socratic way of looking at things to fix everything, to supply you with meaning, you're not going to hanker for anything old-fashioned like the Apollonian and Dionysian, bless him, and something like tragedy, fusing them together. And he says, only after the spirit of science has been pursued to its limit and its claim to universal validity destroyed by the evidence of these limits, may we hope for a rebirth of tragedy. So what Nietzsche wants at the time that he's writing this, for his own time, is something like what Greek tragedy supplied. This Dionysian energy, a realization of sort of the primal unity of all things under appearances, being tied together with something that was individuating, that would supply beautiful images which we would contemplate, and which would not just become rigid. Something like that. And I would say that one of the things that we ought to think about when we're reading this text, we have a lot of other genres of arts now, in the electronic age. We have things Nietzsche would really hadn't, suspected. And we want to ask, do they fall into the same problematic that he's talking about? Or could any of those be the basis for supplying us with this missing meaning? Could any of them supply us with what he thought myth was providing, or what tragedy were providing to us? He says in tragic culture, wisdom takes the place of science as the highest end. It turns to a comprehensive view of the world and seeks to grasp with sympathetic feelings of love the eternal suffering as its own. Maybe that's something we can relate to, maybe not. That's probably the best place to sort of end and sort of open this up for thinking. And I'll answer questions about the text if you want, or we can muse about our own condition, whether we're in a situation like what Nietzsche is describing.
Thank you. So, questions, comments? Dionysian frenzy.
Everyone get up and run around.
I should have brought wine. Any questions? Comments? George. George is good for a question. Thinking of one. I have two things on my mind. So you're being too academic. Don't think, yeah.
Well, for a starter, could you clarify a little bit where Nietzsche thinks this leaves us? I mean, is this a criticism of where we are today, and if so, how?
Well, we have to sort of extrapolate in order to answer that, because Nietzsche's writing over 100 years ago. He's writing at a time where Europe is seemingly self-confident about its capacity to supply meaning. Progress is still something that people are talking about a lot, and things do seem to be getting better and better and better in many respects. He thinks that those are actually signs. Hey, let me read an interesting quote that I skipped over, which kind of addresses this. He says, he's talking about the Greeks, and then he's talking about his own times, and then we'll think about whether it can apply to ours. Could it be that the Greeks became more and more optimistic, superficial, and histrionic precisely in the period of dissolution and weakness, more and more ardent for logic and logicizing the world, and thus more cheerful and scientific? Could it be possible that in spite of all modern ideas and the prejudices of a democratic taste, the triumph of optimism, the gradual prevalence of rationality, practical and theoretical utilitarianism, no less than democracy itself, which developed at the same time, might all have been symptoms of a decline of strength, of impending old age, and of physiological weakness? That's his sort of diagnosis of his own time. And if Nietzsche were around today, after he did the adjustment period of finding what technology's like and all those sorts of things, would he say to us, yeah, you're still living this inauthentic existence, you're all Socratic people? I think he probably would. Another thing that's important to point out, he thinks that the Apollonian, the Dionysian, and the Socratic are all responses that are felt by individuals with noble souls. So some people don't need that. Some people can just say, I'm going to make a ton of money. That's going to be my goal. And sometimes they seem to have a life where that does satisfy them, and then quite a few of them make a ton of money, and then they say, all right, what next? What does this actually mean? And then they might go in one of these directions. His worry seems to be that unless there's some sort of, in this book, unless there's some sort of collective way of doing this, we don't have access to the Apollonian and Dionysian in any meaningful ways that would count. I mean, we can go out and get as drunk as we want on Saturday night and get in a fight and wake up who knows where, and that's kind of Dionysian, but that's not going to supply us with any lasting meaning. That's more nihilistic than just working in the cubicle. I don't know if this goes to answering. Does that answer the question, or?
Well, yeah. So the serious adult side of our lives is Apollonian in a sort of a sterile way, and then to the extent that we have a Dionysian side of our lives, it's just frivolous and childish.
Yeah, in order for them to really work well together, or in order for them to really be what they need to be, they have to work together. There has to be some sort of fusion. And again, at this time, he seems to be thinking that has to be taking place in a collective way. It's not like I can just say, yeah, I need some more Apollonian Dionysian in my life. I'll do that all by myself. That's not going to get me out of it. But you and I and a few other people get together and we form a club, maybe, to do this. Probably something more like a monastery, a secular kind of monastery. Then it becomes possible. He thinks it's happening with German music at the time. This is before he decides that Wagner is not the way to go. This is when he's still liking him quite a bit. And he talks about Tristan and Isolde. Yeah.
Could you elaborate on the pathos of words and images?
Did you say the pathos?
Pathos of words and images that he talks about, and how that connects to, he describes, for example, that some music provides a representation in sounds of natural phenomena. Would you contrast that to, for example, tone painting, or which says is lost away from the dynamism and true fervor of tones?
Yeah, this is one of the things that I couldn't find a way to work into the framework of the lecture. Tone painting is sort of, an emblem of Socratic culture for him. And it's just sort of like aimlessly playing around with the possibilities for, can this depict a brook, or things like that. There's nothing really moving to it. There's nothing gripping. I mean, I guess Nietzsche would probably be against a lot of what we call, modernist music, which is, for me, is unfortunate because I like quite a few of those guys. And I'd like to think that, Nietzsche and them would be compatible, but probably not. What were you going to say?
Well, I don't think he would approve of French Impressionism, per se.
That's too bad, isn't it?
Something like that.
Yeah.
But he does speak highly of Beethoven.
Yes.
When we talk about Beethoven's symphonies or that kind of music, what makes that monumental and worthy?
Because the music is original and not being done to respond to something else. It's coming out of, this is where it gets difficult to express. It's coming out of the artist himself. This is what he calls the spirit of music, Yeah, in later terms, things that would fit into his later works. He thinks Martin Luther fits into this scheme too, which is kind of a fascinating idea. Then again, when you read Luther's works, it kind of makes some sense. He's there's no censor on Martin Luther, an expression of his thoughts. Nietzsche thought that all this is leading up to Wagner. He talks about Tristan and Isolde in this, and he thinks that that's providing a new modern myth. And so, great music will give you that half of what you need, and then if you can actually bring it together in tragedy, you'll have the myth component. Beethoven isn't supplying the myth part. But it's, again, it's better than the impressionistic sort of stuff, which, again, for me is kind of a downer because I really like that stuff.
We have time for one more question.
Sorry I gave such long answers. Yeah.
So would you say then that the birth of tragedy is really his first attempt at the description of the death of the two sides of the divine and the sublime of life? In the sense of, you see transcendence in the Dionysian and the idea of total mystery beyond ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And thus when we suffer, we can go beyond ourselves into that for comfort. And then the Apollonian would be the ordering of suffering through the transcendent coming down. And so, thus, with the death of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, all you have is just the empty forms.
And a lot of other attempts to find something else to fill in those gaps, and purely human attempts, cutting. Yeah, it's good to use the word divine for that. The Socratic is an attempt to have a world that is just truly human, inside and out. And that turns out to be a bad idea for Nietzsche. So you said, is it an early attempt to articulate this? Yeah.
The death of God, but really in the sense of
Yes, exactly.
These two facets of the divine, these two opposing Janus faces, you might say.
Yeah, I would say that's dead on for what this book is doing. But that's probably a good place to bring it to a close.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry to bring you any wine, but